Yeah, thank you. Thanks to those people who are just arriving. We'll just give people just a few seconds while we're just talking through the schedule for today. And so today our webinars on school councils, democratic forums or exclusive clubs. There'll be 3 people speaking, so we're just going to introduce ourselves. But first of all, I'll just give you a quick rundown. So we're going to have some introductions. Then Isabel's going to talk about the key findings of her book, which takes up a lot of the webinar today. Jan's going to follow up explaining how that fits into the wider research about inequalities in access to the civic learning opportunities. And then we'll have a question kind of break midway. So if you are desperate to ask questions about anything that you hear from the first 2 presentations, if you're able to hold on till about 3:40 for a bit of a question break, that would be fantastic. Following on from that, I'm going to talk about what Smart School Council is and tell you more about our programme, our Smart School Councils programme. And then we're going to hear from 2 teachers who use the Smart School Councils programme, and they'll explain how they found it impactful in their schools. And again, we'll have another question break about 4:20 for final questions and a little bit of further information should you want to research or find out any more. So, quick introduction first. I'm Karen. I'm membership manager at Smart School Councils. I'm a former teacher, taught 15 years in primary schools in Yorkshire. A lead professional for PSHE, used to lead on things like philosophy for children, PSHE, school councils. I've been with the charity Smart School Councils for a couple of years now as their membership manager, and more can just see how this programme makes a huge difference. And I kind of wish I knew about it when I was teaching, because it would have helped me greatly in my job as a teacher to help raise pupil voice. So I'll hand over to Isabel and Jan to introduce themselves as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Isabel. I am a former teacher and co-author of the book that we'll be talking about today. I am now working in education research at an organisation called the EEF, which focuses on pupil attainment and addressing the gap in attainment between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to speaking to you all, and thank you very much for joining. I'll pass on over to Herm.
Yes, I'm Germen Janmaat. I'm a professor of political socialization at UCL IOE, the Institute of Education, that is. So that's a faculty of UCL. And maybe Isabel has been very modest in introducing herself, because in fact, this presentation is based on a jointly written book. Basically, it is Isabel who wrote 90% of it, and it is really based on her MA dissertation for the Masters in Comparative Education, for which she received a commendation from the British Educational Research Association from their kind of annual. They have an annual dissertation award, so I think that just demonstrates the quality, I think, of her work, and it fits really in the kind of research agenda that me and my colleague who's working at the University of Roehampton, Brian E. Hoskins, have in investigating social gaps or social inequalities in political engagement. And much of my own research is focused on that. I think I'll leave it there in terms of presentation, in terms of introduction. So I think we can let's pass the word then to you, Isabel, or would you like to make some additional comments, Karen? Okay.
Okay, great. Okay. I'll kick off. I'm also trying to admit people at the same time, so if there's a little pause, it'll be that. So yeah, as we've said, we're going to talk today about this book called School Councils, Democratic Forums or Exclusive Clubs. Bit of a provocative title. You can probably see where it's going. And given we're partnering here with Smart School Councils, I want to make it clear that we're talking about a kind of traditional school council, and I'll explain a bit more what we mean about that. I'll start by explaining a bit about the book and what kind of led me to be interested in this topic, and then present some of the findings. And then Jan will talk about some of the implications and links to other research. And then there'll be time at the end for questions. So please do make a note of any as we go through. So I thought I'd start where the book starts, with the front cover, with this image, which is on the front cover. And the artist is Gillian Holding, who's my mum, and we worked together to create this image. And it was what I thought represented what I was seeing in school. So I mentioned that I was a primary school teacher. I worked before in schools in London, in Germany, and briefly in France. And some of these schools had school councils. And the type of school council that I'm talking about here is the kind of traditional setup would be that it's supposed to be a democratic forum for making decisions about things that affect pupils. So an opportunity to speak and to develop democratic skills and values. But usually the setup is that there are one or two representatives for each class who put themselves forward and then are usually voted in or elected by peers. And it seemed to me that only certain pupils were getting the opportunity to be on the inside within the room. And these seemed to be kind of more advantaged pupils from more privileged backgrounds, and some other pupil groups. And the diversity of the school communities seemed to be kept on the outside, kind of looking in. And this didn't sit well with me. So why didn't it sit well? If any of you kind of work in schools or have been involved with school councils, you might know that they're a really great opportunity. There's research that Jan Herman has been involved in to show that participating in civic learning opportunities, so the opportunity to actually practice democratic skills, can really help to develop skills that people need for later democratic participation. So if it's the case that only certain pupils and only certain pupil groups are getting that opportunity, then it's quite worrying in terms of sorry, I've just had a request to allow the recording. I'm going to click allow if that's okay with everybody, but please turn your camera off if it's not. So if it's only those pupils who are getting the opportunity to develop those skills, then that's of concern, really. So then I turned to the data. I moved into a master's, and Jan Herman was my supervisor. And I wanted to know whether what I was seeing was a real picture, whether it really was the case, or whether I just had bad experiences. So I developed this research question here. Do pupils in different countries, schools, and with certain socio-demographic characteristics have differential access to participation opportunities on the school council? So I'm looking at access, and I'm looking at that in two different ways. There's first the availability of a school council. So do some types of schools or schools with certain student populations, are they more likely to have a school council? And then there's actual participation. So where there is a council, are certain pupil groups more inclined to participate or getting more opportunities to participate? So throughout the presentation, I'm thinking about it in both of those ways. So what we did was we moved to the literature and developed some hypotheses, which the rest of the book then goes on to test. And we developed these hypotheses about different factors that had come up within the literature that seemed to have an influence, or seemed likely to have an influence on access to school councils. So for the sake of time, I'll just focus on the ones that are in bold. So if we look first at the left-hand column, we've got individual characteristics. So we're looking at factors and characteristics that are linked to individual pupils. So the first one there is socioeconomic status, which means social background. And we developed the hypothesis that pupils from more socially advantaged backgrounds might be more likely to participate in the school council. And we thought this because there is, in the general population, it's the case, so in the adult population, it's the case that people from more socially advantaged backgrounds tend to have more power in politics, to have more influence, and perhaps to engage more in traditional shows of democracy. So, for example, voting. And we wondered, well, we hypothesized that this might be passed to their children, for example, through more political discussions at home, or socially advantaged families encouraging their children to get involved in things like the school council. And we also wondered whether pupils from these more advantaged backgrounds might be more likely to have the skills that you would expect representatives to need. So things like good communication, influence with their peers, and that these prior experiences might make them more likely to participate. And the reason that they might have done is because traditional school councils are two kind of key things that we'll come back to in this presentation as well. And that is, they're often voluntary and they're often competitive. So pupils need to put themselves forward first. They don't have to take part. So those with a prior interest or who perceive themselves to have the skills are perhaps more likely to put themselves forward. And then they're competitive. So other pupils, their peers, need to see them as having the skills and see them as ideal candidates. So looking at the next one now, educational aspirations, what this means is the level of education that the pupil expects to achieve. So do they plan on getting their GCSEs, or do they plan to go on and get a degree? And we hypothesized that pupils who had higher educational aspirations would also be more likely to be involved on the school council. And that might be for a couple of different reasons. Perhaps families that encourage political participation or school council participation would also encourage educational engagement. Or perhaps these are generally more confident, engaged pupils who are more ambitious and more kind of interested in school opportunities. So moving now to the school characteristics, when we're now thinking about hypotheses around what kinds of schools are more likely to offer a school council. So we were thinking about the composition of the student body. So what kind of pupil groups are within the schools? So for both of these, so social background composition, so are there more advantaged, disadvantaged pupils, and the ethnic composition, so the ethnic backgrounds of pupils. We found in the literature that schools take different pedagogical approaches depending on the student intake. So for example, schools with more advantaged pupils, more privileged pupils, or rather with more disadvantaged pupils, are more likely perhaps to focus on a narrow curriculum with more emphasis on attainment, perhaps to close any gaps in attainment between those disadvantaged pupils and their peers. So for good reasons, with good intentions. But we hypothesize that that might leave less room for getting involved in school councils and offering those opportunities. And then in terms of ethnic composition, we hypothesized that schools where there were more ethnic minority pupils, that they might be less likely to have a school council. And this was based on some worrying research from the USA, that schools where there were more ethnic minority pupils, there were also harsher security measures. And we wondered whether those sorts of authoritarian measures might translate into something like school councils. So fewer opportunities for pupil voice and for pupils to have a say, and more of a focus on a kind of authoritarian approach. Looking at the country characteristics, within our data set, we were looking at European countries, the ones that were in the data set, so not all of them. And we grouped them into different political cultures based on the literature. on this topic. And what I mean by political culture is the kind of norms around citizenship. So what is the relationship between citizens and the state? What are the expectations around how much a citizen will be able to have influence? And also how embedded democratic practices are. So we grouped countries in this way with the idea that political cultures might be a kind of important predictor of how much access there is to something like a school council. So to give a couple of examples, we grouped the Northern European countries into a Nordic political culture, and these countries typically are associated with notions of equality and inclusivity and widespread participation. There's an expectation that more people are involved in decision making, and pupils in schools are seen more as co-citizens. These are social democratic countries, and we wondered whether that would mean that it was more likely that schools in these countries had a school council. And we also wondered whether it would mean that the importance of social background was less pronounced in these countries because of the focus on equality. This might be contrasted, this kind of culture, with the liberal political culture, where we put England and Ireland, where there is more of a focus on choice and individual rights and opportunities. And we wondered whether there was a bit less concern with fair representation, and whether for that reason, the social background of pupils might be a more important factor when it comes to school council access in those countries. So how did we do it? Kind of the boring part, very quickly. We used quantitative data from this international survey, a really large scale survey with representative samples. We analysed the data in data analysis software. We used SPSS, and we produced descriptive statistics that showed in the first instance, so in the first stage, just the frequency of school councils in these different types of countries and different types of schools. And then we went on to do a more complex analysis, a multi-level regression model, to show the relationship between the independent variables that I talked about, those factors, and the level of participation on the school council. Okay, so here's a summary slide of what we actually found. What I've done here is starred the most important or noteworthy predictors. So these are the factors that really turned out to matter when it came to thinking about access to school councils. So in a sense, there are some positive messages here. So gender, if we look at that, it was basically half and half. There were only very small differences between the two. I wondered from a couple of case studies in the book whether that might be because schools stipulate one girl, one boy from each class, or something like that. But perhaps a positive message there. But I'll run quickly through some of the other predictors that were found to be quite important. So looking at those individual socio-demographic characteristics, the most important were social background and expected education. Why? Well, bringing us back to those two things, that school councils, traditional ones, tend to be voluntary and competitive. And what it means, perhaps, is that pupils need to first learn and then participate. That it's only when they have the skills they are seen as kind of worthy or the right person to vote in. And in the book, we have a case study that demonstrates how that might play out in practice quite nicely. So it's a secondary school in Ireland, and there are peer elections, but the teacher, before the elections, will stand at the front of the class and facilitate a discussion where they talk about what sorts of characteristics might make a good representative. And what that might mean is that it reproduces those ideas about who should be involved, and it means perhaps that pupils from only certain backgrounds are given that opportunity because it's kind of set out at the beginning that it's those pupils that should be involved. In terms of school characteristics, we found that both the social background of pupils and the ethnic background of pupils were both important, but I won't go into too much detail on those for the sake of time. And then looking at political cultures, we found, as hypothesized, that the Nordic countries really did have a high proportion of schools with school councils. So we're looking at about 91%. In Europe overall, we found also a very high percentage, so 81%. There's no doubt a lot more digging to be done there in terms of what all of these school councils are like. But as headline figures, it seems that these are really, it's a widespread opportunity to participate. And then some political cultures with significant differences in terms of how the level of access. What we did then, to dig a little bit deeper, is we looked at one country within each of those political cultures, just to get a better idea of what was going on in individual countries within each of them. So I've already mentioned that England is an example of a liberal culture. And it's a bit technical, but the numbers, the higher the number, the higher, well, the more important the factor is. So in England, you can see that social background, SES here, that is really important in England, more important in terms of access than in those other countries from each of the other political cultures that we looked at. And looking again at expected education, it's again England that comes out on top, where the expected education of children seems to be a really important predictor of participation in the council. And then if we look at the school level, so which kinds of schools are offering the council, again, in England, it's pupils that are in socially privileged and ethnic majority schools who seem to participate more. And this is in contrast to Finland, an example of a Nordic country, where the school, the social background and ethnic composition had no statistically significant effect on council participation. So it seemed that this was particularly a problem in England. And this actually, it aligns with other research, which shows that the social gaps in political engagement are particularly large in the UK. The bars here, taken from Jan Herman's book with Brian E. Hoskins, who he mentioned, the bars are showing the correlation between social background and voting, and you can see the UK on the right there, with the bars particularly tall. This is a strong correlation. So a few conclusions. Social background does seem to be an important predictor at both the individual and the school levels. And the link between social background and access seems particularly pronounced in England. Why? Well, I've said it already. School councils traditionally are voluntary and competitive. And what that means is that you're reflecting the inequalities that already existed in society. And then if school councils do have an effect on development of skills, which there's good reason to think they do, then you're not only reflecting the inequalities, but you're also perpetuating them and passing them on. Okay, thank you very much. I'll pause there and hand over to Jan.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. So how do then our findings tally with other studies that have looked also at what we might call participatory civic learning opportunities, because that is basically what participation in a school council is, right? It's the idea that learning by doing gives pupils, so the students who take part in such activities, a sense of also a sense of efficacy, meaning that they teach them certain skills to participate, which might be good for their sense of self-confidence in participating in these activities. It gives them also a sense of empowerment and of ownership of particular issues that they are discussing, or that they are that they kind of want to bring forward and to highlight as important, on which they seek to change society. And so other well-known participatory civic learning opportunities are things like participation in service learning. We know that from the United States, and there's a lot of research on that. Or participating in discussions in the classroom, participating in, say, mock elections held in schools. And actually on all of those things, we see large social gaps, both from research from the United States and from research in the UK. And also we find that, which already Isabel mentioned, that schools with a disadvantaged intake tend to have less student councils. And if they have such councils, they have less powers. So broadly, our findings are in line with all this other research highlighting participatory civic learning opportunities. But I, together with Bryony, we did not find a social gap in access to citizenship education. That is, in terms of the volume of citizenship education experienced by pupils. But of course, we don't really know what that citizenship education then entailed, whether it included these kind of participatory civic learning opportunities, or whether it was very kind of traditional classroom or teacher-led kind of instruction. Next slide, please, Isabel. Yeah, so what are then the possible implications for policy and practice? Well, to reduce social gaps in access to these participatory civic learning opportunities. Well, should you make them compulsory because they're often voluntary and competitive, as Isabel said? Yeah, but that raises the question, of course, how do you do that? I mean, can you force students to stand as a candidate for a school council? That's, of course, taking it rather far. So you'd have to reflect on that, how you could do that. Possibly teachers or it's actually quite likely that teachers do have an important role there to play in terms of boosting more equal participation in such civic learning opportunities. For instance, yeah, you could think of, if you think of, say, classroom discussions, you can think of giving a quota to each, speech quota to students, just to make sure that all students participate equally. And it's not only the verbally very well-equipped students who do so. Or you could think perhaps of the teacher giving turns. Or in terms of, say, school councils, you could think perhaps of a rotating system so that each student will have the opportunity to, at least for a certain time, be a representative on the school council. Or, and that would be a very then cynical conclusion, is it perhaps the case that middle-class children will always seize these opportunities as long as they're kind of voluntary, and and if compulsory, if you can't really make them compulsory, should we just abandon them altogether? That would be, of course, a very cynical conclusion. So basically, that these civic learning opportunities are always hijacked by the students of advantaged backgrounds. Next slide, please. Well, in that sense, I think I would like here to just highlight some rather encouraging findings from our latest research, which dispel the impression that there is always a social gap in access to these participatory civic learning opportunities. This is following up on the research of our book, and this is a chapter that will be coming out in another book to be published next year, in which we take a bit more of a broader look at many different civic learning opportunities, not just the, say, voting or standing as a candidate for a school council, but more broadly. And we distinguish there between two kinds of civic learning opportunities. The rather traditional, we might say, civic learning opportunities based on knowledge acquisition, and we contrast them with these participatory civic learning opportunities. Knowledge acquisition refers to kind of more teacher-centered forms of education, such as the teacher basically giving instructions and talking all the time, and students listening and taking notes. An emphasis on learning from textbooks, and an emphasis on testing the acquisition of knowledge, and perhaps limited extent also skills, simply with written assessments. These can then be contrasted with these more learning by doing approaches. And what we see then, and we've looked at the successor to the ICCS 2019, which is ICCS 2016, so the data source that Isabel briefly mentioned. So this is actually this large, just briefly, this is this large international survey of 13 and 14-year-olds, and that's really trying to tap the civic attitudes of these school pupils. And interestingly, England used to be part of it under the Labour government. So they participated in 1999 and in 2009. But then when the Tories came to power, they evidently thought this was no longer necessary. So England didn't participate in this very nice international survey. So basically, we do not know anything about the state of civic attitudes of young people already for the last 13 or 14 years. Simply, we don't know anything about it. So what we found using the 2016 data, in which England did not participate, as I said, we found, as expected, that the more the disadvantage the schools intake, the more there's emphasis on knowledge acquisition, CLOs, so the more traditional ones. This chimes with the idea that Isabel also already alluded to briefly, that perhaps schools with a more disadvantaged intake tend to prioritize the acquisition of knowledge and skills, and more traditional methods, maybe also because they think these participatory learning opportunities are more kind of frills that students don't really need, and also that they might risk a breakdown of classroom order. So indeed, we found support for that. We also found that the more advantaged the school's intake, the more the schools offer participatory civic learning opportunities. That chimes with also Isabel's findings. But I have to say, as reported by students. So I cannot emphasize this enough, that it is particularly, I guess, middle-class children who feel that that it's perhaps desirable to answer that they are participating in such participatory learning opportunities. So they might have a better sense of social desirability of social desirability, of what is the desirable answer. When we then, and that's the novelty here, when we then look at the teachers' responses, so that in addition to the students, also the teachers were asked about their modes of teaching and the activities they practiced in schools, then we find that there's actually no link between participatory civic learning opportunities and school social composition. So that's rather encouraging. So this means basically that according to the teachers' responses, they practice as much, teachers in schools serving disadvantaged communities practice as much things like having open classroom discussions about issues, letting students bring up topics themselves, having group work, and a range of other kind of activities, as teachers serving schools with a more advantaged intake. That was interesting. It's a very interesting finding. And what was also quite interesting is that we then linked this data on these civic learning opportunities provided by the school, as reported by the teachers, with student engagement outcomes. And then we saw that the civic learning opportunities, as reported by teachers, had as as strongly an effect on these student engagement outcomes as the civic learning opportunities reported by students. So those are kind of it's actually quite encouraging findings. And yeah, next slide, please, Isabel. Yeah, here I just wanted to see to show that this distinction that I made between these knowledge acquisition CLOs and participatory CLOs. And now this is a type of statistical analysis. And what was quite nice is that I found that these the activities that make up this knowledge acquisition civic learning opportunities, they all grouped together, meaning that those teachers that say that they often dominate the classroom teaching, that the students only take notes, they also tend to use textbooks as materials for students to learn from, and they also tend to practice written assignments. Whereas those teachers then who say that they practice a lot of, say, students working on projects, they also tend to use all the other activities here highlighted in green. So they actually they group quite nicely together these different activities, and you can then apply these labels: participatory civic learning opportunities to the ones marked in green, and knowledge acquisition CLOs to the ones marked in red. Next slide, please, Isabel. And so what then do these findings provisionally suggest? So these more encouraging findings, well, that actually teachers are essential in organizing these participatory civic learning opportunities, such as school councils, making sure that these learning opportunities are accessible to all, and to ensure that they have positive effects on engagement. So I think this more encouraging research shows that we really need to focus more on the vital role of teachers in ensuring equal access to these participatory civic learning opportunities. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention. So I think we now have 10 minutes for questions and answers. Is that correct, Karen? And then we move on to your presentation.
Yeah, that was really, really interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed that. But yeah, we can have a couple of minutes while I know Isabel's going to hand back hosting rights to Greg. So if you have a question about anything you've seen so far that you'd like to mute yourself for, so you can speak, or if you're feeling a little bit shy and you want to type in the chat box, please feel free to do so. So we'll just go quiet for a minute or so, just to give you a moment in case you wanted to ask any questions, and then we'll move on to the Smart School Council's part. I think somebody's just come in view there. I don't know whether they wanted to speak.
I'll jump in if nobody else is going in now. Thank you for the presentation, Becca from the Fair Education Alliance. I had a question around I guess the inverse of the participatory civic learning opportunities and sort of wider school culture on school councils. I did a very similar dissertation last year for my master's on upholding Article 12 in classrooms in the UK versus humanitarian settings. And I found that behaviour policies really impacted broader student participation, and I wondered if that had come up in your research as well, like particularly strong behaviour policies that discourage student sort of engagement, I guess, with decision makers.
I'm happy to start, and then maybe Jan, you want to come in. Not specifically. I think the closest, it's a really interesting point, and I'd imagine it's a really important factor. I think the closest we came was thinking about those authoritarian security measures in schools with a high proportion of ethnic minority pupils, which I think is linked, but not beyond that really. But I think it's a really important point.
Yes, that is a very important point, and of course it is particularly relevant for England, I think, particularly after the introduction of these what's it called again? This referral of pupils. Prevent, exactly, prevent. That's of course the. It could very well be the case that with pupils knowing that they could be referred by their teachers to prevent teams, that this might have maybe some dampening effect on their expressions in classroom discussions, for instance. This is something that is interesting to explore, and research has looked into this into prevent as a securitization measure. There's lots of research on that, and this tends to be from a very critical point of view. But actually, the actual research in classrooms to look at, and then also in a range of different schools, varying in social composition, looking at whether these, say, schools with a more disadvantaged intake, whether they might have stricter disciplinary measures, behavioral measures than those with more advanced intakes, and whether that then somehow has a negative effect on the participatory civic learning opportunities in such schools. I do not know of such research. It would be extremely relevant. But I guess the big problem here is as well as ethical issues, in that it's getting increasingly difficult to obtain ethical approval to enter schools to do this type of research, as well as the time pressures that schools are under. Very relevant question, but I do not know of any research that has looked into this in the English context.
Thank you.
There's just a question in the chat box. Helen says, the difference in participation between Finland and England, is that participation in school councils or participation in CLOs?
So that finding was specific to the school councils research, with school councils being an example of a participatory civic learning opportunity. So the book was focused narrowly on school councils.
Fabulous. Thank you, Isabel. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask any questions before we move on? I should say as well, there is another question stop in about another half an hour or so. So if something pops up along the way and you think, I wish I'd asked that, or can ask again at the end. Okay. Don't think there's anything in the chat box, so I will share my screen. Oh, could you let me share the screen, Greg? Just says it's disabled screen sharing. Okay. There we go. Right, so hopefully that will pop up to you. There we go. So as I said before, everything that I just heard from Jan and Isabel, so interesting. And it really chimes a lot with the Smart School Council programme that we're doing. And hopefully by the end of this, you might see that there are some parallels as well, which just makes me feel really glad that we've linked together to do this. So just a very brief background about Smart School Council. So we're a very small charity. You can just see there's just 6 of us there. All teachers all have worked in education in some way before. Founded in 2016 by Greg, who is here today. He might give you a wave if he's on the screen. And his friend, with the main aim of helping every child raise a pupil voice and be more involved in democracy. I've been with the Smart School Councils for a couple of years now, and every time I come into work, we're getting more and more schools finding it, which is great. We're getting more people kind of hearing about us, which is wonderful. And we've got just over 400 member schools and growing now. And I guess the research behind the mission for the charity linked to what this Children's Commissioner research here says, which is probably no surprise to people who have led school councils before, which is often students not feeling like they're being heard by the traditional models of the school councils. In addition to that, this University of Roehampton research, I think, links to what Isabel was saying before about the socio-economic status, which I'm missing somebody there, apologies, which basically links to the idea that the students who are usually involved in the traditional model of school councils usually come from what you might call a more privileged, a more affluent, a more supported background, whereas the opposite tends to happen in those traditional models of student councils with those students that you might say have less advantage, less support, and less privilege. And that is something that in the programme, the Smart Schools Councils programme, that we really are passionate about involving every pupil voice, regardless of whether, as Isabel was saying before, people feel like, they have to be worthy and then they take part. We really feel that everyone should be able to take part in the school councils and have their voices heard in the setting that they are in to begin with. There we go. Some of these blockers will probably feel familiar to people, again, who are used to having the traditional models of school councils. The idea that the same things come up year in, year out, often because students, I think, are not used to being allowed to suggest those ideas about what we could do differently in our school. How would you see things changing? I think physically, the ideas don't just run out of steam, but I think physically people run out of steam by Christmas. And unfortunately, because school councils can sometimes be seen as a little bit of an add-on, they're often the first thing to get dropped when people are exhausted. And I know that feeling of how many more get-ups till Christmas, and it's easy to kind of push things to the side that feel like they can be pushed to the side. Everything being too paper-based, so things get lost, evidence gets lost, pupil voice gets lost. Whereas I think with this programme, one of the strengths of it is the fact that it is tech-based, and it's easy to do, it's quick to do, it doesn't take a lot of effort, so you're not running out of steam, and it's an easy way to collect pupil voice, but also for people to be able to enact pupil-led change. And there was a mention before about teachers being essential to CLOs, and we are teachers, we know that teachers are essential, and we recognise that in the member schools that we have visited, the more established schools, the more, you might say, successful schools, or the more confident schools are often the ones where there is a passionate lead who leads it. But regardless of that, we do believe passionately that we should be pushing to get students involved more in those leadership opportunities. So that, I think Isabel mentioned before, the idea of being seen as co-citizens, so that they are part of the school and the school is part of them. It's not that they are being allowed only certain parts or only to speak about certain themes. And it's a much more inclusive way of viewing school councils. And then what we mentioned before about the usual suspects being the students who get involved. I know when I had student councils, we'd have the students in the office, at leadership office, and it was often the same type of children, the children who were already good at oracy, gifted and talented. They turn up with multiple badges on the collar because they might also be house captains or team captains, and it does become a very exclusive club. And then it's easy to see why people don't put themselves forward for it, why students feel very disengaged with it, because it's the same type of kids who are getting involved. So the way that this programme works is basically to flip that on its head. So we'll talk about it in a moment. So very briefly, the way to look at it is changing the mindset. So rather than having a small group of students, in the traditional models, where you'd have one or two students, and they would be your student counsellors. They were the only voices that you'd hear, really, because they speak on behalf of the rest of the students in their classes and forms. And they're often the only students that get involved in action. The way that this programme is set up is to say, actually, let's throw that out the window. So we'll have a core group of students who drive the programme, which we call the communication team, and their sole job is just to drive it forward, and they have very specific roles. But every single voice is heard from, and the way we hear from every voice is through these class meetings. And not only do we hear from every student voice, but that it's driven by the student voice. So the topics and the questions are chosen by the students for them to talk about in their class meetings. And in addition to that, the action teams are small groups of students who are able to get involved and lead change themselves. So it's not keeping all voices and all action within a small group of students, which is like the old model of student councils. And I keep saying old model because we don't do that model. So that's what I mean when I keep saying, I should say traditional model of student councils. Let's keep going. So briefly, how have we kind of addressed things? How do we use our programme to raise people's voice? Well, as we said, class meetings involve every single pupil voice, and there was a mention before, I think it was from Isabel, about, or might have been from Jan actually, about whether you should have kind of compulsory CLOs or whether, you know, we shouldn't have those. But the idea with the Smart School Council is that every pupil voice is important, every pupil voice is heard, and every pupil voice matters. So these questions are chosen by the students. They're put into the software, and the students are in their own classes, their own form groups, and they discuss the question that has been set. This is often a very popular topic, mental health, that we see in our dashboard. It's increasingly popular, we find, when we have a look in as admins, that student mental health is really growing in popularity in the questions that are chosen. So students sit in their classes, they have the questions, they choose their options. These options have also been created by the students, because one of the students in the communication team, one of their role is to create these questions and create options for students to choose from, so that they're able to debate what they feel about these different answers, so that their voice is heard and they're able to vote on what they think to each question they set. The communication teams, as we said, the only role that they have is to drive the vehicle forward. So it's imagining that they're basically in a vehicle of the Smart School Councils, they're pushing it forwards, but that's the only thing that they do. Within that, they have very specific roles, and we all know those people who have run school councils before. Sometimes school councils can lose momentum because we give very specific roles to the students. We find that it keeps them a little bit more engaged in what they're doing, but also as well, this program is providing as many leadership opportunities as possible for the students themselves. So yes, we do hear from every student voice, but also the program is designed to enable student leadership. So you're getting students who are question finders. So they're always going around talking to students, talking to staff and saying, what should we be discussing? What is important in our school? What matters to us? What should we discuss in the class meetings? You have children who are in the class meetings actually updating the tool itself. So they're in there with the software, they're creating the questions themselves, they're taking ownership of it. At that point, we often get a lot of teachers who take sharp and take a breath, as you know, oh my gosh, handing this over to the students, how can that happen? But a lot of teachers are quite reassured by the fact that even when they do set the questions, it comes through like a process where it goes to the lead teacher and they can see what question has been set. So there's no accidental surprises, shall we say, as the questions go out. We have action team developers, so the role for students who help other students start action teams going in their school. We have progress board updaters, so rather than your old traditional student council boards, which often have the pictures of the councillors and then the minutes pinned to the board, the progress board shows what is actually happening in our school because we're listening to your voice. And from the members that we talk to, they're saying it's really powerful for students to be able to have a class meeting. All the answers go back through the software to the comms team. They collect those, action teams start off, and then they're able to walk down the corridors and see on the progress board, oh, there's the action team that we wanted, it started, this is the student we need to speak to. It really gives that kind of cycle of our voices being heard, our voices being actioned, and we're being listened to. And lastly, staff liaison. So rather than teachers having to constantly kind of chase classes to remind them to do their class meetings, it's about the actual students themselves chasing and being staff liaison links. I won't go too much into detail with this, but what I wanted to mention with this is that one of the big things with the Smart School Council is that additional step of things can lead to action. Student voice leads to change. It doesn't mean that every single time you have a class meeting question, it has to be something that we're going to change, something radical. It can just be, we want to hear your opinion about something that's happening in the news, something culturally that's happening, a discussion that's going on in school. We just want to hear your voice, which is absolutely fine. But sometimes action will spring up, ideas for change will spring up, and there's a real kind of flow of, we have a class meeting, action gets suggested, and then it gets actioned on the progress board. So there's a clear kind of link, again, that cycle of our voice can lead to change, and we can see that it leads to change in our school, which then just builds that momentum because students are encouraged that they're being listened to and encouraged that they can make a difference, and encouraged to keep raising their pupil voice. Progress boards, we have templates, so we're constantly trying to help teachers to have as many resources as they need, because we know as educators that you have a million things to do. Here's some kind of real life progress boards, and again the idea is that students take charge of these, so that when the students go down the corridors, as we said before, they can see the results of being listened to in their school, and what's happening and what's changing in their school because of their voices being more heard. And then we often get the kind of practicality question from teachers, well, how is this going to happen? How do we get started? Because it often feels a bit like, where do we begin? And what we try to say is it's very, very simple. Basically, people join up at Smart School Councils, they get a link for a launch, a 30-minute chat with us. And then in that 30-minute chat, we go through everything. We go through the resources, we go through the dashboard, we share the software with them and their logins, and then they leave to set up. And as part of that setup, we produce like a member guide, a reference to help you to have something there to follow as you get started and builds that Smart School Council into your school setting. We also try to help in as many possible ways as we can. So we mentioned the member guide, we've got the software, obviously, with the class meeting tool. We also, as a group of teachers in the charity, we are constantly thinking of, actually, what suggestions might we suggest for weekly questions? We know the kind of cycle of schools, we kind of know the areas of chats that comes up most often, and what chat comes up at what time of the year. So we're constantly suggesting and updating and preloading into the software ideas for questions. But what we often find is that our members have like the opposite problem. They have so many questions, it's like, oh gosh, we've got so many to choose from, so you'll never run out of ideas of what we should be discussing in our class meetings. And we do offer as much support for the wider staff. So we offer virtual staff briefings. We also have a growing committed membership who are very keen to be paired up as support buddies. Often, you know what it's like, you're in a school, you feel like there's nobody around you who's kind of thinking like you and wanting to approach school councils differently. Well, we're able to link you up with schools nearby to you, or similar schools who can help you on that journey. And then we do feel like for a small team, we are pretty quick at supporting our members and getting back to people when you need it. So sometimes it's just a matter of somebody wants to drop a quick email to us to ask a quick question. Impact-wise, it is something that we are working on this year, but from forms that we have sent to our members, you can see there that there is a growing feeling with our members that they are seeing a difference, especially those members who have used the programme for 2, 3, 4 years. They are seeing a difference in speaking and listening skills, students feeling like they're being listened to and feeling like their voice is being heard much more. We're particularly proud as well the fact we're getting more mentions in the big O in Ofsted as well. I know it shouldn't be the be all and end all, but let's be honest, sometimes it does feel like the be all and end all with Ofsted. Especially the last few years, we have noticed we're getting more specific mentions. You can see here in this Nampian pointed out the Smart School Councils very clearly as being something of a strength in the school and something that enables every pupil to have a voice. The following year in St Margaret's in Durham, we loved how we were recognised again. as this Smart School Council encouraging pupils into whole school decisions, so really feeling like they are co-citizens in their school and that they matter. And then lastly, most recently, we had one from Hailing Primary, again, who specifically mentioned us. We love this one, creating a happy and harmonious environment. So we're proud of the fact we are starting to get more recognised by Ofsted. And just tooting our own horn, because why not from time to time. We were nominated and won the Association for Citizenship Teaching this year, which we're very proud of. And again, linking with the likes of Isabel and Jan just really helps us to kind of push that message that we really believe in about student voice, student empowerment, and feeling like students are listened to in their settings. At this point, it's always nice to hear from some teachers. And I know we had Louise, and she might be here, so I'll just give her a moment because I'm going to get Maria up. Oh, you go for it then. Do you want to go first? Or do you want a moment?
Oh, no, you're all right. I actually wrote myself some notes so I wouldn't waffle, because I have a tendency to go on about Smart School Council. I'm really passionate about student voice. And I think it's one of those things that a lot of people give lip service to, but they don't actually want to hear what the children really have to say. Traditionally, I think children have been very much told what to say and told the answers to say as well. And that was something that always rubbed me up the wrong way. In our school, children reception to 6 do Smart School Council. I'm not sure if we're 5, 6, 7 years in, to be honest. We're quite a long while in. So I decided to sit down before and write some notes about what they did so that I don't forget. So let me have a look. It says, children know that suggestions, ideas and issues can be raised and will be responded to, and they love seeing things being put into place because of what they've asked. What we've noticed over time is that children are able to explain their ideas and argue their case far more effectively. They're able to do it respectfully, but also challenge children and adults' point of view. This isn't just during school council, and it spreads into every part of school life. So children are confident they can address inequalities, no matter where they come from, adults or children, and resolve matters in a democratic way. So while I was writing this, some year 6 children knocked on the door and they said, we want to talk about the new house leaders. We have, like with Greta Thunberg this year, and they said, we want to make some posters to put up around school. Is that okay? And I said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Do you need any help? And they went, no, we're fine. And I said, I'm just writing about Smart School Council. What do you think about what I've written? And they said, yeah, that's right. I said, is there anything you want to add? And they said, yes. And this is how my school is. So they said they liked being able to talk about their ideas. And even if they disagreed with somebody on their table, that was okay. And everyone understood we all had different opinions, and it doesn't mean you have to fall out with them. And I thought that was just such a major thing that even as adults, I know we all say we can agree to disagree, but then we go home and seethe afterwards. But actually, these children were past that already, and they understood that they could do that. So for us, we've used it in lots of different ways. Sometimes we do really simple things like, what's your favourite Disney character? And we just have, sometimes at the start of the term, it's very much centred on the children. How do you feel coming back to school? But then we discuss really difficult things sometimes. And one thing we did do was rewrite our whole school curriculum. And this is how we rewrote our curriculum, because we asked the children what was good about lessons, what wasn't so good about lessons, what we needed to do more of, all those kind of things. And the kids were really honest with us. And that's what happened. And the children know that things will happen because of what they say. So I actually wrote, it said, the children feel as though they have power in our school, and they do. And I have in the past, and I will continue to recommend Smart School Council because it works. If you really want to hear your young people's voices and give all of them a voice, then it works. If you want to only get the answers you want, then it's not the right thing for you. And that's sort of, I don't know if you want me to say anything else. You know, I'll go on forever, so I won't.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. And I think what I would say from that is, I know when we visited your school, that was something that particularly stuck out to us, the fact that because you've been doing it so long, and the noticing of that language and the way that students, almost like the behaviour, like the way they speak with each other outside of class meetings, has been affected by what's been happening and your approach to the school council. And I guess that's the ideal, isn't it, to kind of have that wide influence.
Yeah,
well.
Absolutely. And they do challenge, and they challenge staff. They will say, do you know, I don't think this is fair because, and we'll say, right, okay, tell us why. And then sometimes you're like, yes, you're right. You know, and because sometimes it is, everybody's human, everybody makes mistakes.
I think it's taking that leap of faith, which can be very scary. I've been an educator for many years myself, and taking that leap of faith to let go of the reins a little bit and just trust that slight kind of pushing over to students and making them more in the front seat of things in school can feel very, very scary. So I appreciate the approach that you have done, and you might notice from Maria, we're going to show Maria's video now, Louise, that there's some links to what you've said as well. So much appreciated, Louise. I'm just going to click this. If for some reason it doesn't come up, give us a shout, Greg. There we go. So Maria was another one of our FAB members, just like Louise. And we visited her school last year, and we just asked her, I think it was Greg, wasn't it? We just asked her to talk about smart school counselling in her school. And she very willingly obliged. Just a couple of minute video here, which is fab. And let me just see if I can get that up. Okay. There we go. Just a bit slow there. I love that video. Maria mentioned the Big Debate Club, which is also part of our charity as well, that also looks at raising pupil voice, in case you were just wondering about that. So great. Oops, Daisy. Stop that. There we go. So yes, that's from great voices from Louise and from Maria there. It's always nice to hear from somebody who's actually using the programme themselves. Hopefully you can see my screen back again. There we go. So we're just coming to the end there. We have a wall of love as well. I won't show you that at the moment, but if you go on our website, we love sharing like social media and seeing students who are having class meetings, who are stood in front of progress boards and really excited about the changes that are happening, that they've driven, that they've led in their schools. So just to finish for the moment, there is chance for questions, and also, so Daisy, sorry, I'm a little bit of bother with my screen there, just one moment. There we go. There is a chance for questions and further information. In case you wanted to know more about the democratic forums or exclusive clubs from book, by Isabel and Jan, I'm sure it's if you search up online, I know we got copies ourselves. You can find them online. And with ourselves, our Smart School Councils, you can always drop us an email, membership@smartschoolcouncils with an s.org.uk if you wanted to know anything more. So I know there's a few people in the chat box that have posted things. So just before we have a look at those, if there's anyone that wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, either something that I've chatted about or something that Jan and Isabel mentioned before that you've realised you'd like to ask, or maybe you wanted to ask Louise herself, one of the teachers who use the programme. Just give you a moment in case you wanted to unmute yourself. And if we don't have anyone unmuting ourselves, we'll go to the chat box and see if there's anything in the chat box. Okay. I'll just stop sharing the screen for a moment. Okay. Okay, I'll go to the chat box instead just while we're waiting. We're just a little bit ahead of schedule. I can see one here from Carl. He says, hi all, in case it's useful, we at the University of Birmingham are conducting a related study on youth engagement on race and faith equality at school, and he's left his website address there. Thank you very much for that, Carl. Let's see if there's any others. Sophie asks, is this team, I think she's referring to the communication team, please text in the box if I'm wrong, which says, is this team supposed to be elected through a vote? What we find is that we advocate that students apply for the specific roles. We find that works most successfully, so students who are clear about what the specific role involves, and whether they are interested in taking part in it, rather than it becoming, I guess, a bit like a popularity contest and a vote, which sometimes elections can be. You know, I've had elections before with student councils, and the democratic part of like voting feels really great and feels very authentic in many ways, but sometimes it can feel a little bit like a popularity contest. So yeah, we do advocate applying for the positions, and we do have those resources, application roles prepared as part of the programme package if people join. We've got another one here. It says Greg Test, but I know that's just a typing error. But we've got, we are a primary school and we have been doing this for 5+ years, and it works, and it works very well, and we personalise it too as reception to Y6. Fantastic. Great to see that you're here today. I wish I knew who it was so I could give you a shout out, but thank you for that. It's wonderful to see. And we do have a lot of people who've been with us for quite a few years, and it's, I guess, retaining people is an indicator of people finding it a successful way to do school councils. We've got another one here. Can you buddy from Jennifer? Do they buddy up with older children to be able to use ICT? We find two main ways with our memberships. From speaking with our members, we find that some schools do that buddy system. So they'll have a role like the question tool updater, which is the ICT role that you're referring to, and they'll put a younger student with an older student just to support. Some of our primaries say, well, actually what we will do is we'll just choose our communication team from our older students, like 4s, 5s and year 6s, because of the nature of the roles. And you don't need to worry about thinking, well, how is student voice, how do they have opportunity to lead the younger ones? Because every time there's a class meeting, all the teacher needs to do is click it open with a link, and then they can get students to the front. Like I think Jan was mentioning before about rotating, so you can get that students rotating to come to lead these class meetings because they're just clicking through slides. And I'm sure you know as well as I do how quickly students, even up, you know, knee-high, can click through an interactive whiteboard to show this is the question, this is the option, this is the vote. And we do try to make it as inclusive as we possibly can. There's another one here. Again, a Greg Test. I'm presuming this software can be put onto iPads. Yeah, it's a link. So it can be opened, excuse me, it can be opened on tablets, iPads, interactive whiteboards, Chromebooks, absolutely fine. So yeah, that's no problem. It says here, Lauren Tate, how many out of your 400 schools are primary? It's roughly about 70%, 30%. 70%, put my teeth in, 30% split. So about 70% primary, about 30% secondary and sixth form. And she says, and is it successful? It seems quite secondary led. I'm not quite sure what you mean by it seems quite secondary led. I wonder if you're suggesting, like, does it work better in secondaries? We don't tend to find that. We tend to find that what the secondary settings often do is they adapt it more to link with maybe existing leader groups. Like we have some schools who might have like eco-warrior groups, LGBTQ plus groups in their school, and they'll kind of link those groups in to the student council. For example, there might be like the focus term. So they might say this week or this term or question is going to be set, and it's going to be something to do with eco theme, because that's something that the students are all talking about. So let's involve the eco warrior leadership team. So we often find our secondaries adapt it more to include existing leadership groups in their settings. I hope I answered that, Lauren. Is it okay for Key Stage 1, 2? Yes, we even have nursery only schools who are on the programme. We've got a great video on an actual Key Stage 1 class, a reception class, having a class meeting, and it's so adorable when they physically use the students to stand in different areas to represent, like, this is choice 1, this is choice 2, so they physically can go and see and look at each other and see how big the vote was, because sometimes there's abstract ideas of like numbers, like, well, 14 students voted for this, 5 students for that. It feels weird for very young students. We're very happy to share that video with you if you find it useful. It was recorded by one of our members. You can drop us an email, a membership at Smart School Council if you'd like to see it. And just another couple here. So we've got middle schools. There's a different rate for primary and deemed secondary. Slightly different rate, but there's 2 packages. I won't go too much into pricing now. I know it's probably not what time is for, but we feel like we're very competitive. Our essential package is £299 a year for primaries, and I think it's £100 more for secondaries. But please drop us an email or visit Smart School Councils to find out more. We feel like we're very competitive. And then just the last couple. There's one about elected teams, do they change? Yeah, we mentioned about encouraging students to apply for roles rather than it being kind of like competitive. I know there's a mention before about feeling that sometimes things can be far too competitive and excludes students who might want to get involved but don't like that kind of idea of competition. And what we find with our longer established schools is that they'll either change per year, so they'll have a completely new set of communication team students, or they'll kind of fade in and fade out. So they might say, if we're choosing from year 4, 5 and 6, for example, then each year there's each year the students move up, then we can kind of introduce the next layer of students. So they always get a new year and some existing students that stay. I hope that makes sense. And then I don't think there's anything more. Just people just saying thank you for that. Thank you very much for coming. Do we offer templates for application forms? Yes, we do. We have those. People mentioning Big Debate Club. Glad you're enjoying it. And then I think that's it. Gosh, I zipped through those last few. So I'll just stop sharing for a moment so we can just have our kind of closing comments. I just personally wanted to say thank you to Jan and Isabel for linking up with us. You know, I think it'd be great to kind of keep our links going. I think there's a lot of things that we see eye to eye on, and I think it'd be great to explore that for the future. I'd also like to thank people for joining us on probably what is your first week of term, or near the first week of term, on probably a quite warm day when it's been quite tempting to go out and sit in the sunshine, or I'm saying that's probably go and mark in your books, isn't it? Let's be honest. But I appreciate you giving your time to come along to us. Isabel or Jan, would you like to say any last couple of words?
Yeah, I would just like to say a massive thank you to you Smart School Councils for having us here to speak today. I think it's like doing academic research, it's a privilege really to be able to speak about it outside of academic circles and to talk to people that are actually involved in putting things into practice. So thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you Smart School Councils for having us here.
And I can just totally confirm those words by Isabel. I think we really would like to thank you, Smart School Councils, for giving us a platform to present our research, because as it often happens, I mean, when we present in academic circles, we have seminars of maybe just 15 people coming along. And here, look at this, a huge number of participants, also the ones who are perhaps later listening to the recording. So for us, this gives us a tremendous good opportunity to really spread the findings of our research. And I'm actually, this is quite an eye-opener for me to see how students can arrange the school council themselves. So I was quite thrilled to hear about this different process, this process that you developed for making it totally student-led. I couldn't help, by the way, and then I'll stop, sorry, but I couldn't help kind of a naughty little voice in the back of my mind saying, but what happens if students then start to kind of propose rather controversial, say, changes to be made in the school setting? Let's say the use of smartphones in class, or the use of gaming consoles in class. That then, of course, raises some interesting issues. But okay, and I'm sure you have thought about that, but I'll leave it there. Thanks again for giving us this opportunity. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, I appreciate that. I didn't mention, actually, I should have mentioned, we, as part of the progress board, one of the things we do clarify is, you know, not everything is possible, but you will always be listened to. And if it can't be done, we will explain to you what the reasons behind it. Rather than just kind of a no, blanket no. But yeah, I appreciate that very, very much. Some lovely messages in the chat box, so appreciate those people who have come who are members. I can see that some members from Newbridge College have joined us as well. And thank you, special thank you to Louise for giving up her time as well in a very busy start of year. If there is anyone who is desperate to stay on just for a couple of minutes to speak with us, feel free to stay on just for a few minutes. Otherwise, we will send you a follow-up email tomorrow, and you will get the recording of the session in case you wanted to rewatch it at any point. And within there as well, there'll be a mention of Isabel and Jan's book, and also our email if you wanted to get in contact with us. So we'll just stay quiet for a couple of minutes while people are dropping out. And then if there's anyone left wants to unmute themselves and have a chat with us for a couple of minutes, then that's great as well.
Sorry, I was on mute.